Hello, my name is Jane and I'm second year studying the Bachelor. Today's Bible reading comes from Luke 14. Luke 14 verses 1 to 14. Luke 14. One Sabbath, when Jesus went to eat in the house of a prominent Pharisee, he was being carefully watched. There in front of him was a man suffering from abnormal swelling of his body. Jesus asked the Pharisees and experts in the law, "Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath or not?" But they remained silent. So taking hold of the man, he healed him and sent him on his way. Then he asked them, "If one of you has a child or an ox that falls into a well on Sabbath day, will you not immediately pull it out?" And they had nothing to say. When he noticed how the guests picked the places of honor at the table, he told them this parable. When someone invites you to a wedding feast, do not take the place of honor, for a person more distinguished than you may have been invited. If so, the host who invited both of you will come and say to you, "Give this person your seat." Then humiliated, you will have to take the least important place. But when you are invited, take the lowest place, so that when your host comes, he'll say to you, "Friend, move up to a better place." Then you'll be honored in the presence of all the other guests. For all those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. Then Jesus said to his host, "When you give a luncheon or a dinner, do not invite your friends, your brothers or sisters, your relatives or your rich neighbors. If you do, they may invite you back, and so you will be repaid. But when you give a banquet, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind, and you will be blessed. Although they cannot repay you, you will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous."
Have you ever been completely certain about something, only to find out that you were completely wrong? Come on, be honest. Has there been a time where you were just so sure that you were right? You knew it, but actually, you found out you were wrong? Well, today I would like to tell you about a time when that happened to me. But first, I would like you to allow me to introduce myself. My name is Abdiel. And I've been a follower of the Way for 20 years now. And I've been invited to this gathering of believers here today to share my testimony with you. I was one of the privileged ones who met Jesus. I ate with him. I heard him teach. I saw him heal. There's so many stories about that day that I could share with you. But today, I'm just going to share one of those stories. The story of the day that I met him. Have you ever deliberately broken a pottery jar? We used to do it as kids. If we found an old, unused pottery jar, we'd pick up a rock and we'd smash it. Have you ever done that? Have you ever noticed that it doesn't always break with the first blow? You hit it once and you weaken it, and you hit it again and cracks start to appear, and then you hit it a third time and finally it collapses into little pieces. Well, on that day when I met Jesus, I began that day as a strong, intact pottery jar. And on that day, I received 3 blows. 1, 2, 3. And on the third, I collapsed, broken into tiny pieces. And it was the best thing that ever happened to me. So let me tell you what happened. It was a dinner party organised by Benaiah. Now, Benaiah was a Pharisee, just as I was. We Pharisees were the most respected men in town, but Benaiah, well, he was the most respected of us all. He was the head of the synagogue. He was a leader. He led the way in calling us to purity, in calling us to holiness before God. He led the way in obeying God's laws, Sabbath laws, food laws, fasting, tithing, ritual washings. But I believe that if the nation was going to be blessed again by God, we had to be pure, we had to be holy. And as the head of the synagogue, he kept the synagogue holy. He kept out the impure, the tax collectors, the prostitutes, the sinners. He kept them out. Well, when I got invited to a dinner party at Benaiah's house, I got a tingle down my spine. This is the first time I'd been invited to one of these prestigious gatherings. I glowed with pride. I mean, if I was being noticed by him, if I was being honoured by him, I must be winning the respect of important people. Once word got around that I'd been at his party, once people started to see me as someone who would eat with Benaiah, wow, people would treat me differently. People would think of me differently. Well, the time came, midday, Saturday, and I went to Benaiah's house. I arrived. Wow! The guest list was amazing. It was a who's who of our town, all together in one place. There was the most godly, respected Pharisees. There was the most renowned, honoured experts in the law. I felt so good. I felt so proud to be considered part of this group, like I was one of them. Well, we performed the ritual washings, and I made sure I did it when Benaiah was watching because I wanted him to see just how carefully I did it. And then it was time to find a seat. So Benaiah's chair was in the centre of the table, and the most honoured seats for the most distinguished, high-ranking guests were at his left and at his right. I saw a seat just 3 seats away from Benaiah's, which was still empty. Now, a few hours earlier, I'd been so excited just to be invited to this party, but suddenly, out of my heart, I had this new, even higher ambition. I thought, what if I could get that seat? Just 3 from Benaiah. What would my neighbours say if they heard that not only was I invited to Benaiah's house to eat, but I sat just 3 seats from him? What would they say? I saw a guy called Hiram. He is an expert in the law. I saw him heading for the same chair. So I picked up my pace. I jostled him a little. And I got there first. I took the seat. I sat down. I had it. I had a seat of considerable honour, just 3 seats away from the great Benaiah. But just as I was about to begin eating the food, this was the food that had been prepared the previous day before the Sabbath commenced, I noticed 2 other guests there who I did not expect to be there. One was Jesus. See, at this time, everyone had been talking about Jesus. He'd been going from town to town, apparently healing, teaching, and he'd been building up quite a following. But Benaiah hated Jesus. Almost all of us Pharisees hated him. He undermined everything that we worked so hard for. We were working so hard for purity, for holiness, and he went around breaking the Sabbath, spending time with unclean people, not fasting, not ritually washing. Benaiah hated Jesus. Why had Benaiah invited him? And the second unexpected guest was this sick man with swelling of his body. I didn't know the man's name, and quite frankly, I didn't care to. He'd probably done some terrible sin to be so afflicted by God like that. And besides, with a condition like that, he was probably having bodily discharges, which would make him unclean. I found his presence quite offensive, and I was glad that I wasn't sitting anywhere near him. In fact, him being there was starting to take the shine off my invitation. Why had Benaiah invited him? Why had Benaiah invited Jesus? And then I twigged. It was a trap. Jesus, sick man, Sabbath day, it was a trap. I'd heard that some Pharisees had been looking for a way to catch Jesus, to arrest him, even to get him killed. And so it all made sense now. Benaiah was laying a trap for Jesus. This was so exciting. I'd be here to witness it. I couldn't wait to see it play out. And sure enough, as we began to eat, there was tension in the air. Tension. Everyone's eyes were on Jesus. They were watching him. They were waiting to see what he would do. And with the man with swelling right there in front of Jesus, and a whole table of Pharisees and experts in the law just watching him, Jesus spoke. And he said, "Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath or not?" Jesus knew exactly what Benaiah was up to, and he cut straight to the chase. Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath or not? And do you know what Benaiah said in response? Nothing. Benaiah was silent. The experts in the law were silent. Everyone was silent. I wasn't quite sure why. Was it because of the trap? They just wanted it to play out. They didn't want to do anything that would get in the way of the trap. Or was it because they didn't actually know what they should say? Well, whatever the reason, everyone was completely silent. So what would Jesus do now? Would he still go ahead and try to heal this man even though he hadn't been given permission from all these religious authorities, from the synagogue hierarchy? Jesus turned to the man. He took hold of him. I flinched as I saw him touch this unclean man. But Jesus, he took hold of him in a kind of embrace. And he healed him instantly. It was stunning. One moment, this pitiful man with swollen limbs, a swollen belly and pasty skin. One moment he was diseased and unclean, and the next moment he was whole. He was healthy. He was released from his suffering. He was blessed. It's really hard to describe how I felt at that moment. I felt like I was being pulled in two directions. I mean, on the one hand, I was stunned, I was outraged that he'd broken the Sabbath. Everything I'd heard about him was true. He didn't seem to care about the Sabbath law. He didn't care about purity. He was so brazen. I mean, he did it right there in front of all the religious leaders, in front of Benaiah. He didn't care what they thought. On the one hand, I was outraged, but on the other hand, I just witnessed something incredible, something beautiful, something very attractive. It wasn't just the power that Jesus had, although that was amazing, but it was also the goodness and the kindness, the compassion that I saw in him as he embraced this sick, unclean man and released him from his suffering. Where did that compassion come from? Where did that power come from? I felt like I'd been given like a glimpse or a window into something really special, but I didn't quite understand what it was yet. Well, next, Jesus sent this healed man away, to send him away. And off he went. He was healed, he was free, he was whole. So I said before that on that day, I was like a pottery jar that took 3 blows to break. Now, you might have thought that the first blow was the healing, but actually, it was what Jesus said next after the healing that was the first blow. He turned to the rest of us after the man had left, and he asked us a second question. He said, if one of you has a child or an ox that falls into a well on the Sabbath day, will you not immediately pull it out? If your ox, if your child falls into a well, would you pull it out? See, this was the first blow. See, I'm a father, and at the time, my son Adalai was just 5 years old. If Adalai fell into a well, would I pull him out? I didn't actually plan to listen to any of Jesus' arguments, but I couldn't help imagining this. I couldn't help imagining Adalai in a well. If he was there in a well on a Sabbath, would I pull him out? Yes, of course I would. Of course I would. Is that how Jesus saw what he'd just done for this man? An act of love? Like the love that a father has for a child? Like my love for Adalai? I mean, I'd never looked at the unclean and felt that way about them before. And that's when I had a really disturbing thought, a really unsettling thought, a really unwelcome thought. What if the one that God blesses is the helpless one who needs rescue? The helpless ox, the helpless child. See, I'd always thought that the one that God would bless would be the one that obeys his law, the one who does the ritual washing and tithing and fasting better than most others, the one who deserves to be blessed. But if what I had just witnessed was God pouring out his blessing in a miraculous healing, and it seemed like I had, if that really was God pouring out his blessing, then maybe my understanding of who God blesses was all wrong. Because he hadn't poured out his blessing on Benaiah. He hadn't poured it out on the other Pharisees sitting at the table or on me or on anyone who deserved it. He'd poured it out on that unclean man. You see, I had always thought that the way to access God's blessing was by obeying, was by being holy, was by being pure. But then why had God poured out his blessing just now, not on any of us who had worked so hard to make ourselves holy, but on this unclean, undeserving, sinful man? And that was the disturbing thought. That was the first blow to the pottery jar. What if I had it wrong? What if I had the law wrong? What if I had God wrong? Blessing wrong? What if the one that God blesses, the one that God welcomes into his kingdom, is the helpless one who needs rescue? So my mind was racing. Surely not. Surely not. Surely Benaiah would correct Jesus. Surely Benaiah would speak now and point out where Jesus went wrong. But Benaiah didn't say anything. Benaiah was silent. Everyone was silent. No one could speak. No one was able to say a thing. So that was the first of the 3 blows. The structure of the clay jar had been weakened. The second came soon after that. You see, Jesus had been watching us. Benaiah might have planned this whole dinner party so that we could watch him, evaluate him. But actually, all the time, Jesus had been watching us, evaluating us. And Jesus had seen how we'd scrambled to get the best seats at the table. He'd seen when I jostled with Hiram. He'd seen us all jockeying for the seats of the greatest honour. And he told us a parable. This is what he said. He said, when someone invites you to a wedding feast, do not take the place of honour, for a person more distinguished than you may have been invited. If so, the host who invited both of you will come and say to you, give this person your seat. Then, humiliated, you will have to take the least important place. I mean, can you imagine the shame of that? Imagine if you picked the seat of honour right next to the host, and then someone of higher rank, higher status turns up, and in front of all the watching eyes, the host comes over to you, asks you to vacate the chair, and you have to walk all the way down to the very end of the table. Can you imagine the shame of that? Every public step with all those eyes watching as you walk from the position of honour right down to the position of shame. Can you imagine that? I imagined, as Jesus was talking, I imagined Benaiah asking me to vacate my seat for Hiram. I shuddered. What a humiliation that would be. Well, Jesus kept going. He went on and he said, but when you're invited, take the lowest place, so that when your host comes, he will say to you, friend, move up to a better place. Then you will be honoured in the presence of all the other guests. I imagined that. I imagined that if I'd taken the last seat and then Benaiah had come to me and said to me, move up, sit next to me, sit in the seat of honour. I mean, wouldn't that be fabulous? Wouldn't that be wonderful? What an honour to be raised up by the host, to be lifted up by the host as the most honoured person. Well, just when I was ready to file this away as really good dinner party advice. Just when I was ready to do that, Jesus said one more thing that changed the way I understood the whole lot of what he'd said. He said, "For those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted." I said before that I was like a pottery jar that took 3 blows to break. Well, this was the second blow. And Jesus said that final sentence, "Those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted." When he said that sentence, I realised that he wasn't teaching us about table manners and dinner parties at all. He wasn't simply helping us to avoid shame at a banquet at all. See, I'd heard enough sayings like this to recognise that he was now using end times language, judgment day language. Those who exalt themselves will be humbled, those who humble themselves will be exalted. This was end times language. Jesus wasn't talking about what a host would do at a party. He was talking about what God would do on that last day. And then I remembered Jesus was famous for speaking in parables. This was a parable. This was one of Jesus' parables. A parable about how we approach God. A parable about how we enter into the kingdom of God. Jesus was saying that just like a wedding guest who rates himself higher than he should, just like he could be shamed and humiliated and sent away, so too a person who rates himself higher than he should before God will get shamed, will get humiliated, will get sent away. It's a parable about how to approach God. I imagined me on that last day, jostling for a spot in the kingdom, arriving at the doorstep, hoping for honour, expecting honour because of what I'd done, because of who I was, because of my purity and my holiness, my fasting and my tithing. And then I imagined God sending me away to the place of shame. I imagined and I shuddered. And then I imagined the opposite. I imagined me coming to God, broken, needy, humble, resting on nothing I'd done, like a helpless ox or like a helpless child calling for rescue, or like a sick man who knows he needs healing and has no other options. I imagined coming to God like that, and then God coming to me and raising me up, lifting me up and into his kingdom and giving me a place of honour. See, this was the second blow to the clay jar. It wasn't broken yet, but the cracks were starting to appear. I'd always believed that if I was going to be welcomed into God's kingdom, if I was going to be honoured on that great day, it would be because of what I'd done. It would be because of who I was in the community. It would be because I kept the law more than most other people did. Now my mind was swirling with new ideas. Could it be that the one who's welcomed into God's kingdom, the one who receives God's blessing, is the sick one who comes needing that he knows rescue, knowing that he needs rescue? Could it be that the one who is blessed is the humble one who comes needing to be lifted up? Well, that was the second blow to the pottery jar. And there was one more to come. Jesus looked around at the table. It was a table full of the town's most influential, well-connected, respected people. And then he turned to Benaiah, the host, and he said, "When you give a luncheon or dinner, do not invite your friends, your brothers or sisters, your relatives or your rich neighbours. If you do, they may invite you back, and so you will be repaid. But when you give a banquet, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind, and you will be blessed. Although they cannot repay you, you will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous." It was incredible. I'd never seen anyone speak to Benaiah like this. This was a public rebuke, a public shaming. It was like Jesus didn't realise who he was speaking to. I don't actually know how Benaiah felt when Jesus said this, but I can tell you what I was feeling. Because for me, this was the third blow to the pottery jar. Don't invite the influential, the able. I mean, that's what I always did. That's what we all did. Instead, invite the outcasts, invite the needy, invite those who can never repay you. I never did that. That would be social suicide. If I invited the outcasts, I'd be identified with them. I'd be treated like them. I'd be considered as one of them. This advice, it seemed completely upside down, but it was actually his reason that really struck me. Because when he said, invite the poor, invite the crippled, invite the lame, he said, then if you do that, you will be blessed. On that last day, on the day of the resurrection, then you'll be blessed. Then you'll be repaid by God. Bit by bit, stage by stage, at this dinner party, I was getting a whole new picture of God, of what he's like. If God put on a dinner party, who would be invited? See, up until that moment, I thought it would be us. I thought it would be me. The group sitting at the table, these good, respectable, devout people. But was it possible that the ones that God would invite would be the outcasts, the poor, the needy? The ones who I'd always thought didn't deserve to be invited? This was the third and final blow to the pottery jar, because as it struck, I realised that if that's the case, if that's who he invites, I wouldn't be there. I wouldn't be there at that great eternal banquet. Not because God wouldn't also extend the invitation to me, but because I wouldn't have gone. I wouldn't go to a banquet with an invite list like that. If I knew that the outcasts were invited, I wouldn't go. My mind was racing. I was rethinking everything. The one God blesses, the one he welcomes into his kingdom is the helpless child who knows that he needs rescue. It's the sick man who knows that he needs healing. It's the humble one who knows that he needs God to lift him up. It's the poor and needy outcast who knows she doesn't deserve to be invited. As I sat at the table that day, gripped by Jesus' words, I realised that for my whole life, that hadn't been me. In the 20 years since I became a follower of the way, I've shared this story of the dinner party at Benaiah's house. I've shared this story with many people. And when I do, people often ask me, they say, Abdiel, what changed the most that day? Was it the way you related to God? Or was it the way you related to other people? And you know what I say? I always say both. Both changed the most. You see, that day I began relating to God in a completely new way. I came to him broken. I came to him needy. And when I did, I received his compassion, his mercy, his grace. It was a whole new way of relating to God. But at the very same time, I began relating to people differently too. I started to treat them in the same way that God treats me, with compassion, with mercy, with grace, giving up my seat for others, being generous to the needy, and inviting them to my house. In fact, it's because God has treated me with compassion, mercy, and grace that now I can treat others the same way. Both changed the most. But living this way hasn't always been easy. When I first became a follower of the way, Benaiah was furious. I never got invited to his house again. I became like an outcast to him, to all of them. And when that happened, I felt a strong pull. In fact, I still do feel a strong pull sometimes today to restore my standing in the community, to be observed and admired again by people that matter. It's an itch for honour, an itch for status. I've been tempted to use invitations to my house to build up my honour again and to pursue the right seats and all of that. It hasn't always been easy. The pull to my old way of life is still there, but when I remember Jesus' compassion to that sick man that day, when I remember that same compassion is the compassion that he shows me, when I remember that, that's when I'm able to show compassion and mercy to those who could never repay me, no matter what the cost to me. So that day, at the dinner party at Benaiah's house, when I met Jesus, I've said I was like a pottery jar that received 3 blows. And when the 3rd blow struck, that jar broke into little pieces. I had been a strong, intact, complete pottery jar, but now I was broken. And because of that, I was ready to enter the kingdom.